Hi, and welcome to Growing Old Around the Globe, Week Two's webcast. I'm Ann Shoemaker, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kelly Jordan Shudo's Research Associate, Dr. Chala Akai. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we're also joined by Sarah Kagan from her office in Oxford. I just want to remind you as we start the webcast, please tweet us at Old Globe MOOC or post your questions to the webcast forum under week 2 to send your questions in for Dr. Akai. Sarah, would you like to offer some remarks about some things you've been seeing on the discussion forums this week?
And it's so nice to be here. It is a lovely day here in Oxford, England, and I'm privileged to be visiting the Oxford Brookes University here in Oxfordshire. It's also really a thrill for me to have Dr. Akai join us today. I think her perspective will be very important to the discussion and dialogue that we're trying to build. Perhaps one of the first things that I can offer to the webcast is just to note that you and I and the rest of the Old Globe team have been in conversation about the assessment and evaluation of participant performance in Old Globe, and we have made a decision that the portfolio will be marked on a different sort of rubric. So we wanted to let you know there will be an email announcement coming out about that. But Ann and I are happy to share that based on our own deliberations, the feedback of the team, and very importantly, the feedback of participants, we've decided that the number of points required to pass Growing Old Around the Globe and receive a Penn Statement of Accomplishment is 7 out of 12 points. So that's my first comment and thought for today. And then I'd just like to say that as I review the discussion forum and the different threads, and I'm looking at them on my iPad as I speak with you right now, I am very impressed by the different dialogue strands of dialogue that are going on across the discussion forum in different threads. And I think that Chala's presence with us today is a good opportunity to highlight some of those threads. I was really interested to see that a number of people, if you refer back to my week 1 summary, a number of people were a bit puzzled by my statement that what is old as a term, what is old, as a question, is controversial. And what I meant by that is that if you refer to the breadth of the discussion forum, so a number of you are really focusing as participants on one thread in different questions throughout the forum. You're focused in a primary area of interest for you, which is really wonderful, because we want this course to be personally meaningful to each participant who takes it. But I'm conscious of the fact that if you back up a bit and look at the discussion forum broadly, I think you'll see what I meant by that statement, and that is that if we try to define what is aging and what is the state of being old, there are a number of different debates going on, and we see that in the over 6,500 participants who are now part of Old Globe, but we also see that in the scientific literature. And I would say that the most controversial aspects seem to be around the biology of aging, particularly because I think it's difficult as human beings to separate ourselves from our own experience and our own observations if we're not scientists, or even if we are scientists, to back up and say, but what is the cellular and subcellular biology of aging? What are the issues, concerns, critical questions, and most importantly, what's the state of the evidence now? So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to have Chala join us in the conversation today. So I think those are my remarks from over here across the pond.
Thanks for addressing those things that came up in the discussion forums for us. And to that point, we want to clarify this whole idea about biological aging and the marker of biological aging. But first, I would like to introduce Dr. Akai, and you work with Dr. Kelly Jordan-Shudo. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research and your interests in aging?
First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to contribute our perspective on the process of biological aging. Kelly and I, we have been working on how the brain ages, but as she has mentioned before, we look at it from a pathological perspective in the context of disease. But overall, our interest is by using these disease models, try to figure out how the brain ages and how inflammation, actually the body's response to external and internal toxic factors, how the brain responds to it, and how that response inflammation contributes to aging. So this has been our focus of research in our lab. What Kelly mentioned in her interview was age of 50 as...
Yes, this has been very controversial, as we just said, on the discussion forum. So let's talk about that age of 50.
Yeah, let's clarify that because I'm getting there and I don't want to be so close to that number. Actually, we're not as close to that number as we think, because what she was mentioning is what happens at the cellular level in an individual cell, the beginnings of aging, is a metabolic slowing down, as a decreased ability to fight off toxins, and as a start of decline. It is not necessarily the onset of aging. When you look at an organism level, like as a human being, these cellular changes will accumulate over time, and then it will not become obvious until later in life. There is a definition proposed by the United Nations suggesting that individuals aging 65 and older should be considered the aged population. So actually what Kelly mentioned doesn't contradict this, because it takes years at a cellular level, these changes to accumulate to have an impact at the level of the organism. So I think 50 is not when you start aging necessarily, it's when the processes start for aging.
So when you look at cells, you just said you're looking for maybe slowing of metabolic processes and things like that. But when we talk about people being older, an older person looks many different ways. They're not all having the same shared experiences, because you have personal experiences that shape how you feel about things. You might be actually feeling better as you get older. Your social situation might change. So that impacts how you feel. But in terms of this age of 50, what Kelly was trying to say was it's the cell. There are changes that are happening in a cell.
At a microscopical level, not necessarily as an organism. The aging process, I think, it's also controversial to say, but I think it starts from the age of 2, 3. It's an accumulation of these damages that accumulate at the cellular level, such as DNA damage, sunburn, or poor nutrition, or stress, emotional stress, accumulating over time, taking a toll on the body that actually come to a threshold after which the ability for the body to cope is not enough. So that obviously changes from person to person, and it also obviously changes from culture to culture. For example, globally, I don't think, a clear definition of aged population with regard to age.
There's not that cutoff that we have.
There's no cutoff.
Yeah.
When you look at globally, for example, aging, the age at which you are considered old is different when you go to Japan,
Yes.
China, or some other country in Europe versus Africa or North America.
Mm-hmm.
So there are projects that are looking into this at the social level. For example, in Africa, it is considered a lower number,
Mm-hmm.
whereas in North America or Japan, perhaps, it is the age of 75, 80. So this is not only because of the organism or at the cellular level, but also cultural. There's a cultural contribution to that too.
And this may also be based on longevity in these countries. In countries in Japan where we know people might live longer and their life expectancies are longer, old age is older because you're living further into that time.
Exactly.
Whereas in Africa, there's not as much longevity in terms of a continent level, so
Exactly.
that old age is younger.
Exactly. Yes.
And you raised many great points talking right now, and I actually wanted to talk about a question we had for the webcast last week about inflammation and aging. And what are some of these processes? What are the impacts of inflammation on aging that you can speak about from your research?
Even though our research is focused on the brain,
Mm-hmm.
I think what I can tell you will apply to many different parts of the body,
Mm-hmm.
and that's probably the approach of the course anyways. So inflammation is, with the, most basic explanation is the body's response to any external toxic factor.
Mm-hmm.
It can happen in the brain or the gut or the stomach or the heart. Mm-hmm. If it's an acute, very immediate response, it usually goes away once the toxin is removed. Mm-hmm. But it leaves behind some kind of marker, and over time, these small insults will accumulate. Mm-hmm. And as the cell ages, as the metabolic rate goes down, as the ability to, for example, repair the DNA goes down, or if the antioxidant capabilities of the cells go down, mm-hmm. These damages will accumulate. And it will happen not only in one part of the body, it will happen everywhere. Mm-hmm. And the really tricky part is that once you have inflammation in one part of the body, it will not affect only that part of the body, but it will have consequences on the other parts of the body. For example, if I want to give an example, diabetes. It is an mm-hmm. inflammatory process in a sense.
Okay.
With the cell not being able to handle extra glucose. Yeah. So what happens is that the inflammatory cells come into play, and they try to deal with this high glucose and the toxic byproducts. Mm-hmm. But these cells also disseminate through the body, and there is an emerging concept that this inflammatory response will actually make it worse for the brain mm-hmm. to handle the aging process. So what you think of as a peripheral disease, inflammatory process like diabetes, or it could be arthritis or some other inflammatory processes like lupus, for example, mm-hmm. will eventually affect the brain or the heart or the kidney. So that's why understanding inflammation and finding ways to cope with inflammation, I think, is important as a whole system.
Sarah, do you have any comments about inflammation and aging?
Thank you, Anne. And Chala, I think your explanation is so important. Again, you're guiding us to think about the idea that biological aging is a genetically, epigenetically, and cellularly mediated process that has variation when it's applied to individuals. That is, that all individuals don't age biologically at the same rate. And your interpretation, if you will, or your explanation of Kelly's comment about what the age of 50 means in terms of seeing cellular processes shift is very important. It made me smile because when lecturing to undergraduates, I would commonly say, in the 3 hours that you're going to be sitting here, remember that your skeleton is aging, because what we see is that during the second and third decade of life, there are major changes in skeletal structure, not at a gross level, but at a cellular level, where the osteoblasts, those cells that build bone, and the osteoclasts, those cells that remodel or destroy bone, but it's really a remodeling process, the balance between those two cells changes on those two types of cells. And that, I think, is illustrated in your reflection on what Dr. Jordan Shudo had to teach us. I also think that the other thing that I'm taking away from the conversation that you're having, Anne and Chala, together, is that while we really need to think about biological aging at a population level and an epigenetic level in terms of large scale exposures to environmental influences, think about solar exposure, exposure to sunlight. That's different depending on where you are in the world and depending upon your genetic makeup and, for example, the amount of pigment generated by the melanocytes, the pigment producing portion of your skin. And that is genetic, but solar damage, sun damage, is epigenetic. And I thought that was a very important point, and it contrasts to really well with the idea that psychological and social aging, while they have some group effects, those are not generally population effects. They are cohort effects. And we talk about this in gerontology a lot, that people born at the same time in the same place, and you can define place in very different ways, town, village, country, those effects are felt at a cohort level rather than a biologic population level. And that's another way of distinguishing biological from psychological and certainly social aging. And I really appreciated your comments that allow us to see those interpretations of these central concepts.
So we have two questions coming in via Twitter, and they actually they have a commonality of diet, and Dr. Akai is going to explain this for us. So we have one tweet coming to us from Tokyo. Hello, Tokyo. What is the largest difference of the aging process between Asian and Western people?
I have been to Japan, and I have some personal experience with regard to their way of living. And I think the reason why there is such a big difference in aging and why there is such a big population of aged people in Asia or in Japan versus Western countries, there are, I think, at least two major factors. One is very immediately recognizable is diet. Because it is rich in omega-3 fatty acids and low in processed foods, that's going to have a big impact. This actually has been supported by animal studies and in human long-term progressive studies that diet plays a role in aging.
So these omega-3 fatty acids, what's their positive effect on the body?
They help the cell to cope with the oxidative stress, actually, like Kelly had mentioned and Dr. Gur had mentioned, also for proper myelination of the nervous system and also the maintenance of the synapses, and also in the periphery, just to, there's trans fats, there's saturated fatty acids, and the omega-3 fatty acids. So those are less likely to form atherosclerosis, the thickening of the blood vessels, which eventually lead to heart disease and hypertension. And so diet in that regard plays a very important role. I think that is one part of why we have this big difference in longevity between Japan and Western. And on that note, I want to mention that when a study was conducted to look at immigrants from Japan coming into the United States in the 50s, I think, I might be wrong, they saw post-World War II that the next generation's lifespan were the same as the US-born US residents. So this actually reinforces the idea of diet and also the environment and in the aging process. So the other aspect, other than the diet, I think is the social structure. And I'm not too familiar with it, but I have a feeling that the family structure will be very different between Japan and the Western countries in the way they approach their elders, the way they interact with their elders, that might play a role. I don't know if you have any comments to make on that, but I think that's part of it.
Sarah?
Yes, that I think is something that's really just emerging now as a body of science. Anthropologists have, of course, studied family structure and family associations and relationships in a wide variety of cultures since the first part of the 20th century. Excuse me. But what we haven't seen is a very huge body, a large body of evidence that allows us to understand exactly the role of family structure and family relationships in relation to adaptation, daily life, and function as we age. One of the things we spoke about on the webcast last week is that part of the emerging nature of the influence of family and family structure and relationships in aging is that it's only in the past 2 and 3 decades that we've really seen profound extension of long lives in places like Japan, Macau, and Hong Kong, places where we have some of the longest life expectancies on average and some of the most remarkable individual longevity. Because remember, average lifespan is a population measure. Individual longevity, who's the oldest person in the world, for example, is something that attracts many people interested in aging. And what we are seeing there is the emergence of multiple generations of families living for and with each other in close communal ties, and that cultural variation is exceedingly important, I think. Here in America, we're now seeing many more multi-generational families because our average life expectancy is increasing. It doesn't match Macau or Hong Kong, where life expectancy is longest in the world currently, but it is shaping individual experiences, so that, for example, this generation of school-age children and teenagers will have very different understandings of family and generational and intergenerational relationships because of that. So that is something to keep our eyes on, because while we think we know what that is, the science, the evidence isn't really there yet in a compelling way, in part because things have changed so much.
So we also had another question coming in from Twitter about humanoids and the ability to reduce inflammation and defending against diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Can you speak to that a little bit? Do you know about the research on humanoids?
I don't know specifically on humanoids. I'm not too familiar with it, but I think it's an extract coming from cumin. But there are studies that investigate such extracts from natural products, such as soy or green tea or cumin, perhaps. And there have been several studies in animals, and perhaps in some studies with humans involved, showing that they might actually help with preserving some, for example, cognitive function in the elderly, not necessarily treating, but preserving what is left. So I think they are all valid to look at, but there's a problem when you go from animal studies to human studies, like Kelly had mentioned, where when you look at human studies, there are multiple other factors going on. So, for example, the environment they are in, their stress level, their social structure will also affect the outcome of such studies. So it may not be immediately very obvious that these products are helpful. So what they might see like minor improvements or contribution to well-being, but I believe that it doesn't hurt to have, these products in your diet because they are natural and they are known to have antioxidant properties, and it doesn't hurt to have these in your diet at a reasonable level. But it's not to say that these are the magic bullet therapies. You have to supplement it with exercise, good social interaction with your surroundings, and trying to stay away from disease in general.
So the theoretical basis for a lot of these products or antioxidants are to reduce the oxidative stress. Is that correct?
Yes, or inflammation in general. Yes, that's true.
I mean, there's a lot of talk, and a lot of times the marketing of these products, I think, exaggerates the benefits that we know in any human studies that we currently have.
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't mean that they are not helpful, but not one product is likely to help, because the human body is very complex, and even though you can alleviate some of the oxidative stress or the inflammation, there are so many other things you have to control for. Only taking a pill every day will not solve the problem, unfortunately.
There was a lot of talk on the discussion forums about diet and how diet affects aging, and about this idea of calorie restriction to increase life expectancy and longevity, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory diets. Even lately, I've heard people discussing gluten-free diets as a low inflammation and possibly maybe a diet that might increase longevity. I know that your research does touch on these subjects. Can you talk a little bit more to that?
Yes. Excuse me. Yes, I can. I think the basis of dietary restriction is to make sure that you don't accumulate fat over time. And fat provides a site for inflammation if there is more of it, and you become more sedentary, and then your metabolic rate goes down, which contributes to cellular aging, and it triggers a cascade of events.
Interesting.
So instead of carrying around this extra fat, don't carry it by restricting your diet by calories. But I don't think that necessarily means that you have to restrict certain groups of foods, such as the carbohydrates or protein or sugar per se. A lot of studies have shown the Mediterranean diet, which is based on a balanced diet of protein, carbohydrates, and fat at several percentages is actually a very good diet for you. Which shows that cutting down on your carbohydrates in the short term might help you calorie-wise, but your cells need calories through carbohydrates. Your brain functions on glucose because the fat cannot go through your blood-brain barrier, so you need that source coming in. Also, as far as fat goes, as long as you choose the right kind of fat, not saturated fats, but like omega-3 fatty acids or fish oil, you can actually harness the good aspects of the fat in your diet. So as long as you're not accumulating fat by restricting your calories to what you're going to spend through the day, through the week, and looking at the portion of fat in your diet and looking at the type of fat in your diet, I think you can increase your well-being over time. So dietary restriction is good in the sense that you don't go to the extreme, and staying away from processed food, and taking fish oil doesn't hurt if there are other extracts like green tea extract and stuff. As long as you talk to your doctor about it and make sure that it doesn't interfere with what you have, I think these are doable, very practical approaches.
But again, not magic bullet. No. These products in themselves aren't the answer to the aging process. And do we really want an answer to an aging process was another controversial topic. Sarah, did you have any insights into some of these discussions on the discussion forum about this whole aging? Do we want to be aging? Do we want to stop aging? Really, what's the purpose behind these diets and these creams and maybe plastic surgery or things like that?
Yeah, I think you and Chala were really, it was almost as though my own thoughts were echoed in what you were saying, because there are two ideas that I think are really central for me. The first is that I want to sort of provide an overarching commentary on the conversation you and Chala have just been having. And that is that we're talking about balance and moderation, and the idea that there is no answer to aging that is really coming from a place that aging should be stopped or modified. And that, I think, allows me to comment on the idea that anti-aging, as we mentioned last week, is a rather challenging or even troublesome term. In part, it's the old gerontologist joke that I will probably repeat every week, and that is to say that another birthday, getting older, is better than the alternative, which is of course death, and that brings up the question of decline, functional decline, which again is highly individually variable and can't be fixed. It can't be described in a single way. It also can't be fixed with a single thing. There is no way, for example, that taking curcumin, a cuminoid, or resveratrol, another flavonoid that's got a lot of attention in the popular press. None of these are, as you point out, magic bullets or single answers to a process that we, at a psychological and social level, seem to have varying responses to understanding, and that's where I think some of the anti-aging controversy comes in, and that's certainly been visible in some of the posts about, and Jenny Mackness, one of our teaching assistants, has been sort of curating a conversation about plastic surgery in a couple of the posts. So this whole idea of balance and moderation, I think, guides us to an interpretation of how do we understand aging well, aging gracefully, but not being naive or even blindsided by the whole understanding that, in fact, human life is finite. And while we see remarkable increases, especially in the past couple of decades, in life expectancy at an average level, in an average way for populations, and we're seeing remarkable increases in individual lifespan, longevity, what we have to balance here is this idea of the finite nature of human life, the finite nature of our own mortality, against how we interpret science, particularly biological science, being careful not to fall prey to the almost commercial media sensationalism of resveratrol will be your answer to anti-aging, to fighting aging, or curcumin, because I thought the question about humanoids was so valuable. It allows us to understand that no single thing, as Kelly said and as Chala has reiterated, no single thing is going to stall, reverse, or alter the aging process within an individual in a substantial way. But rather, there are ways that we can combine efforts to provide a sense of well-being, a sense of aging well, as Liz McKenzie and Amy Corcoran have talked about, and understanding how we balance the science in our own lives as well as in our communities. Because remember, Old Globe is really about how do we look at growing old around the globe and come up with ways to shift conversations, to innovate solutions, and to change what we can sometimes see as a fairly bleak future. So thanks. I think this is a very interesting conversation we're having today.
And there has been a lot of philosophical questions and discussions on the discussion forums, which have been great. So this whole idea of anti-aging, do we want to not age? Do we want to be young forever? That whole, the Goldilocks, I call it the Goldilocks complex. I don't want to be too young. I don't want to look too old. I don't want to feel old. I don't want to feel too young or have the immaturity of being young. And I think there's a point for everyone that they have maybe in their mind, or maybe society places on them, that this is a good age or a good age range. It's not too young or too old. And how do we address that, taking into consideration all of the science, but how do we address that? And it's really going to come into play for the week 4 discussion that we have on what is it to age well. And so that's great that that's all coming up now and how we're building on these topics. There was also a pretty active forum discussion that I think needed some clarification in terms of scientific terms, and it's about, so both Dr. Jordan Shudo and Dr. Gore brought up these concepts of neuronal growth, cell regeneration, and neuroplasticity, and I just would like, Chala, if you could, to clarify some of the differences or what these experts meant when they were discussing these topics.
Okay, that's a very important thing to talk on for a little bit, because even for scientists, you have to think for a second when you're talking about neuronal growth, regeneration, plasticity. Mm-hmm. In fact, they are they are different, and it's very simple, really. So when you're talking about neuronal growth, in general, you're talking about the birth of a neuron during neuronal development, after birth, or in the womb, and then after birth up until 2-3 years old. So that is how a neuron starts from a stem cell and differentiates into a neuron and matures, and then starts making these connections with other neurons called synapses. When we're talking about regeneration, it is actually the response, when they were talking about regeneration in the lectures, it is the response of the neuron, or rather the brain, to injury. For example, there could be a loss of neuron, and even though it was known until recently, there is a limited regeneration happening in the brain. So I'm just going back, and a disclaimer, I'm talking from the aspect of central nervous system and brain and the neurons. So regeneration is replacing the lost neuron with a new neuron that's coming from a small reservoir of stem cells that are residing in very specialized parts of the brain. And it's a very limited and slow process. It is thought to be a limited and slow process. It is very hard to show this in humans, while it's happening. Obviously, you cannot do live, imaging or microscopy in the human brain, unfortunately. But the animal studies suggest that there is some replacement of lost neurons with new neurons coming from the stem cells. So this is regeneration. I think that's what it's meant with regeneration. Neuroplasticity, on the other hand, refers to damaged neurons that are not dead, but they are damaged with trauma or drug use or alcohol or loss of oxygen, stroke, for example. That's more common in the aging older population. And it's the ability of the neurons to actually replace the lost synapses or provide new connections with the surrounding neurons. And one thing to think about in the aging population, neuroplasticity, I think, is the most relevant, because there is a limited ability of the neuron to replace the lost synapses with the new synapses, but that ability tends to go down with age. So the science is trying to find a way to extend the ability of the neuron to make the new synapses, and natural products and resveratrol and green tea extract or curcumin, these come into play in these studies. Neuroplasticity is rewiring, and I think that's the area where science can make a big difference with preserving function or repairing function that was lost with stroke or alcohol or old age. So
it's rewiring. When the path is interrupted of these synapses or connections by something like a stroke,
exactly,
the ability for the brain to create new connections and go around this roadblock.
Go around the roadblock. If the other neuron, this neuron was interacting with, if the other neuron is damaged beyond repair, it will die. But this other neuron has the ability to make synapses still. So it's a way to, that is what plasticity refers to. So, and it's a very important point at which you can actually encourage the neuron to make the new synapses, not only by using chemicals, but also, like, it has come up before, by doing Sudoku or...
Yes, very popular in this country.
Yeah, and there are newer electronic games, you can use those too, but also exercise, which will increase the oxygen coming into your brain and providing support to these rewiring efforts. So I think in the context of this lecture, neuroplasticity is the most relevant.
Sarah, did you want to clarify any of these points further? I think Chala did a great job of differentiating what we meant by neuronal growth, cell regeneration, and then the difference between regeneration and neuroplasticity.
I agree. I think that is a comparison and, if you will, practical application with some great examples. I really loved your description of neuroplasticity as rewiring, which helps us to understand that what we're really doing when we talk about exercise and, if you will, exercising mental function, is that in terms of the science, we're trying to promote neuroplasticity. And it makes me think of a comment that I think Kelly offered when we did her interview for the video. And that is, she pointed out that, like diet, exercise is something that should be done with the idea of, by an individual, with the idea of the individual's whole health. But that we see what we see at a scientific level is that if we increase oxygen delivery to the brain, we can promote neuroplasticity as a particularly adaptive cellular mechanism in the face of damage. And your example, Chala, particularly of stroke or other situations in which nerve cells will die, and, if you will, create a roadblock that other nerve cells that are still alive have to go around, is, I think, an incredibly important idea for the discussion forums and for the focus of this course. Thank you.
Sarah just had another, we just have a comment in the webcast forum.
Yes.
About someone who had the experience of having older adults, so a father and uncles, of different people saying they felt old when they reached 60, meanwhile other people saying they were young at heart when they were 85. And really about, does our self-perception of being old affect how we feel and our activity levels? Can you talk to that a little bit more?
Certainly. There's some exciting new research going on in psychology that suggests, even very concretely, and some of you here in North America may have noticed this in the popular press, because it did get a little bit of popular press about 6 weeks ago, and I am a little bit jet lagged, so unfortunately I'm forgetting the names of the researchers who looked at the function of people who used the self-reference of old as opposed to those who did not. So I'll give you an example of, oh, I'm too old to do. I'm too old for that. And that's a little bit like Anne's Goldilocks model. I need to be just right. Those people who say I'm too old or that's not appropriate for my age may in fact experience, and again, this is not about individuals, but this is about a statistically significant finding in a sample of people selected for a particular study. Those individuals as a group showed overall that if they were thinking of referring to themselves as old, they didn't function as well as those people of the same chronological age range who didn't use those terms. And I find that it's interesting to think about different languages and different cultures and how we understand too old, too young, and age appropriate. The Goldilocks model that Anne uses to explain that we struggle with this as individuals, we struggle with this as cultures. What is right for the age? But what we know is that self-perception and self-reference as old may have an influence on how we function, how we act on a daily basis. I think that also helps us to connect with the idea that Hala mentioned earlier, that old at particularly social levels, the definition of old in my society, wherever we are in the world, has many different influences and varies a great deal around the world and has changed over time. Where 65 used to be considered old in the middle of the 20th century, we now see most people who study aging from health and social perspectives are really saying that 75 or 80, as Chala pointed out, 75 or 80 is the marker in high-income nations like Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, where I am today, and Australia, for example.
So we have a few other questions coming in, and I think they are related, and we're talking about oxygen to the brain. And one participant who's watching our webcast just wanted clarification on how do we increase oxygen to the brain. And I think there's also this question in the media and lay people have that is increased oxygen to the brain. We always say it's good, but then is there a negative component to it?
So I think the part of the confusion comes from what I said with regard to exercise increasing oxygen to your brain. Mm-hmm. So first, let me clarify. You want oxygen in the brain, obviously, for your cells to, function. But in certain cases, when there is blood vessel dysfunction that accumulates over age with having bad diets, with the fat accumulating in your vessels, the oxygen that can reach to your brain diminishes over time. So by exercise, you can overcome this. Even if you had a bad diet before, you can circumvent this problem by exercising and increasing your oxygen. Mm-hmm. So that's what I meant. But overall, in a perfectly normal organism, individual, you want to have enough oxygen to provide for the aerobic metabolism of the cell. Mm-hmm. But if you have too much oxygen, it will lead to reactive oxygen species, which is the source of oxidative stress within the cell. So having too much oxygen, that's why will lead to oxidative stress and will lead to damage. So you want to avoid that. Mm-hmm. But what I meant when I said increase oxygen was in cases when people are older, they are more likely to have blood vessel problems, circulatory problems, and that's when you want to increase your oxygen. As far as the oxidative stress goes, usually, all the cells have the ability to cope with that with endogenous molecules like glutathion or other molecules and organelles
coming from within the own cell.
Yes, within the own cell, mm-hmm. They are endogenous mm-hmm. molecules, and there are genes also which actually trigger certain pathways to handle the reactive oxygen species and to remove them from the cell or neutralize them, if you will. So the idea of using antioxidants is at that point where you replenish the endogenous levels of these, the intrinsic intracellular levels of these antioxidant molecules. So,
and that's answering our question that came in from Margaret about cell regeneration and glutathione.
Yes.
Sarah, any last thoughts about this week?
First of all, I want to say how exciting I found your conversation. And again, with the idea, Chala, that you're reflecting in terms of aerobic exercise, for the most part, but exercise promoting perfusion, that is blood flow to the brain, and increasing oxygen delivery to the brain. This again brings to mind this theme that we have about moderation and balance. That is that the human organism really is seeking a level of balance, a level of moderation, and has endogenous, built-in mechanisms to respond to extremes. And this is a central idea as we try to build on the idea of biological aging and move forward to better understandings and full, rich discussion of psychological aging, social aging, and how these come together. Because, of course, human beings are, as you two have really emphasized for us today, we are neither the sole biology of our organism, nor are we able to overcome biology purely by psychological and social force. There are boundaries on all of these ideas, and how they come together is perhaps one of the most important things. I guess my thoughts on this week are these. The first, that I hope all of our 6,500 plus participants, as well as our entire teaching team, are enjoying the rich variation in the dialogues that are developing. And I hope that at some point, each participant will have an aha moment related to what interests him or her most about how important the dialogue has been in learning, shaping ideas, and providing evidence. But I also hope that people understand that aging, as a very broad area of scientific investigation, as well as an area of interest in the humanities and the arts, aging is not easily answered. There aren't finite, concrete answers that allow us to say that aging is this and being old is that, and these are the important directions. If that were true, clearly the societies around the world which are feeling the most precipitous gains, if that's a term, the sharpest gains in aging at a population level, excuse me, would not be struggling for local and societal solutions. That's why we decided to do this course as a course intended for anyone and everyone, and that's represented in the age and backgrounds and geographic locations and cultures of our participants. So I hope that this week has been about crystallizing some important ideas about the biology of aging, thinking about what is aging as opposed to what is old. Aging is a process. Old is a state with variable definitions, and some that we may decline and others we may accept. And I believe that this will allow us to go forward into weeks 3, thinking about aging societies, and into week 4 when we think about aging well, and shift the conversation to the second half of the course, starting with week 4, to think about where is the innovation, where is the creativity, and where is the realism. We're living with boundaries in biology, in psychology, and in social terms as well. How do we work within those boundaries, press on them, push on them, as well as considering where are the opportunities to change the dialogue, to shift understandings, and to develop interesting and innovative solutions. So I guess that's my summary for week 2, and certainly we'll be sending out a week 2 summary as a group.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And just to close, I would like to thank Dr. Chala Akai for joining us last minute today, as Dr. Jordan Shudo did have a family issue to attend to, but we appreciate it. We had a wonderful discussion today, and I'm sure all of our participants, this is great material to keep the discussion forums going. One last reminder, we started the webcast by saying that we have discussed and changed the minimum grade requirement to receive a statement of accomplishment for the assignments, for your portfolio assignments. It is now a 7 out of 12, and we will be sending out an announcement, and it will also be in the mid-week announcement. And we will update the course, the assignments page on the course site to reflect this new information. Thank you for joining us.